I don't know if it exists in the UK, but if nothing else, this book really made me want to try a 25 with chicken. Woof woof! Hey guys, it's me Marcus, aka the Mad Dog, and we're back with another video. Written by Tom Taylor and illustrated by a handful of artists throughout the run, the first issue of All New Wolverine was published by Marvel Comics in November of 2015, with the 35th and final issue being released in May of 2018. And the girl previously known as X-23 has taken the mantle of Wolverine, with an opening mission to save clones of herself from a life of death and destruction that was almost her own fate. Laura embarks on a journey that will teach her what it truly means to be the Wolverine. With the help of a psychic clone Gabby and a literal Wolverine that's called Jonathan, they will cross paths with the majority of the Marvel universe. She's going up against assassinations, a killer virus, and a team that's been built to avenge those that have been hurt by the X-Men. And when all's said and done, can Laura step outside of Logan's shadow? The art in this is pretty much what I come to think of when it comes to the Marvel Now era. It's decent and there's some real standout moments, especially at the beginning, but at the same time an artist could change between issues and are very rarely noticed. What every artist managed to nail though was the pacing. That could also just be due to the scripts, but on each and every page there was just something that I found fun or interesting, even if it was just a conversation between two characters, and it was something that carried across the entire book. And this seems to be something that I always end up picking up on when I review a book, but the comical expressions were great in All New Wolverine. I knew Laura through her time as X-23, but there wasn't really a lot that I could remember about her personality. And obviously since then she has aged and grown up, but I just think that there was just so much character that came through in the art. It was the same for Gabby too, and Jonathan, and other characters that popped up throughout the book. And I felt like this was a massive factor that helped distinguish it from other Marvel Now books, which I originally just lumped this with. Because there are some similarities that I see between other books, and it does feel that whenever I pick up a book from this era, they tend to have a bit of a similar look, but especially in the sense of humour and the way that that was illustrated, this makes it stand apart. I had to double check this next point as well, because the annual that crossed over with Spider-Gwen was illustrated by somebody that had previously worked on All New Wolverine, but he managed to adapt his style so that it suited Spider-Gwen as much as it did Laura. And I felt like this was a perfect integration between those two styles, which originally did look a bit different, but as soon as you see them on the page together, it all makes sense, and I just think that this was a really great issue when it comes to the art. And to its credit, the opening artist on this book, even if I am saying that it looks like a lot of other Marvel Now titles, was really strong at telling this story. Now that we've moved on from the Marvel Now era, I can appreciate it for what it is. There's detail in there, but it's got this cartoony seriousness, which reminds me a little bit of Darwin Cook. And I like that in this debut issue, when all eyes would have been on it, they didn't go for this dark, grisly, gritty Wolverine look that you'd come to expect. And there was a real standout moment with the chase in Paris, and there was just so much frantic energy. It was just illustrated so well. All the chaos was going on, but you could still see exactly what was happening. It had that great sense of speed. I kind of wish I could see this guy work on some kind of flash book. It's actually quite difficult to review the art when there are so many different people working on it. It was one of the problems that I had when I reviewed Batman by James Tynion. And more so than that, because a large majority of the artists on here only do an issue or two. And there were still some things that I liked, like the penciling work during the Civil War II tie-in. I thought the arc after that in the small town and then Madripoor really reminded me of something that was done by the Luna brothers. And if I'm just being plain honest, no one in this book did a bad job. I do wish that the final arc had a different look to it, something that would have set itself apart from the rest of this omnibus. But it is a very balanced job throughout, and at least if nothing else, it gets the action right, and that's probably the most important thing. And just one last thing on the art, the redesign when it came to a costume was just phenomenal. Just a few costumes throughout this. I definitely think that the black and grey one is the best, which is why I had to shell out for the DM variant. And yeah, it does look a little bit like the Uncanny X-Force costume, but when I think about Logan Wolverine, I think about him in yellow and blue or yellow and black. But when I think about Laura, I see her in grey and black. And if you ever want to pick up any DM variants of omnibuses, you can get them from the channel sponsor, Organic Price Books. They've got great packaging, fast shipping, and amazing customer services, and if you use code WOOFWOOF, you'll get $2 off your order. And if you're ordering 3 or more books and you want them to be delivered together, make sure you use code WOOFWOOF, ship it together for 5% off your entire order. Don't worry, you can just copy and paste them from the description down below, and you can use these codes as many times as you like. When it comes to the story, I went into this book with a completely open mind. I had no expectations, and I had a really enjoyable time. This really is a quick read. I read this back back in January and I've just been that busy since that this is the first opportunity that I've had to film a review. So forgive me if I skimp out on some of the details. But despite that time since I've read it, I still vividly remember the story arcs throughout this and some of the bigger moments. It really stuck with me because I've noticed that I can put a book down and genuinely forget about it the very next day. Straight out of the gate, there was a ton of pace and I was just fully on board. Everything in Paris was great, and if you were somebody that didn't want to see Laura in this role, then don't worry because it doesn't even give you enough time to try and doubt her. And it caught me up pretty quick with where she's at with her abilities, has she grown as a character, and also some of the relationships that she's established with characters like Warren. And this just seems to be a theme in Marvel Now books, that the first issue was just chaotic. And although the rest of this first arc doesn't have the same energy as it did when Laura's in Paris, it was still an enjoyable time and a great reintroduction to this character. Like, it's unfortunate that the last time that I had seen Laura was during a role during Logan, and I know that I'm completely in the minority with this one, but her character annoyed me. I know a lot of people won't agree with me on this, but just because a kid's violent or swears, it doesn't make them a good character, and I hate kids. What I also liked in these early issues is that the cameos from other people throughout the Marvel universe didn't feel too forced. Taskmaster appears? Sure, yeah, that makes sense. Crossover with Spider-Gwen? Yeah, why wouldn't that happen? However, after the first arc or two, this felt like a gimmick that really overstayed its welcome. At first as well, it made sense from a fan standpoint because of the fact that you're trying to get them to accept Laura as Wolverine, so why wouldn't you have other characters featuring and just see how they interact? But then, you know, as you get further into the story and the Guardians of the Galaxy are appearing, you've also got Ironheart and, you know, admittedly, I didn't really enjoy the storyline that they were in, so maybe that's why I'm picking on them in particular. But it just felt at those points that it was done because of the fact that maybe they didn't trust that Laura could hold her own story. Some plotlines seemed to be entirely created just so that they could shoehorn in other characters, rather than it being that Laura was just on this adventure and other people would just happen to appear. In saying that though, there was an issue early on that featured Squirrel Girl where they introduced Jonathan the Wolverine, and this was a really fun issue. It wasn't trying to change the status quo, nor was it integral to the overall story besides the introduction of one of the side characters. But I do like when a run has to have a filler issue, maybe because of some kind of upcoming event that it's got to time issues with, and it's still fun and manages to do something for the character. There were a few moments like that throughout the omnibus, and some of them, like this one in particular, were more enjoyable than some of the bigger story arcs, which we'll get to. Speaking of which, I really enjoyed the Generations issue. This was definitely one of my top 5 favourites in this entire omnibus, which I find quite ironic because of the fact that I'm trying to argue that Laura doesn't need Logan to stand on her own 2 feet. And this was pretty much a one-issue showcase of everything that was great in this run. Solid action, nice quips, and a lot of emotion at its core. And I have to give it respect because it showed the contrast between the two Wolverines and pretty much shoved it in your face that they are different characters, and that Laura isn't just trying to be a girl version of Logan. The Civil War 2 tie-ins were another interesting part of this story. Often when I read issues that have been affected by a major company-wide crossover, it completely derails the storyline that's already been going on. And if you want to see an example of a book where that happened, check out my review of Batman and Robin by Peter J. Tomasi, whereas All New Wolverine kind of just kept going on the same path. These issues with Old Man Logan were great, and it was an example of where I felt a crossover with another character was really warranted for the story. There was a lot of intrigue, I wasn't sure who to trust, and I could enjoy the story without even really having to remember what happened in Civil War 2, which is probably for the best. This feels like what event tie-ins should be. Find a way to adapt, but still keep going with the story that you were telling. But my one grievance with this arc was S.H.I.E.L.D. Sure, yes, they had to be involved, but they were there the entire time and did very little. And there was one major oh shit moment in this story arc, and honestly, if it would have been a permanent change, I probably would have put the book down. And it's probably one of the only instances where I've been okay that a book decided to do something for shock value. The dynamic between Laura and Old Man Logan was great as well, and I actually wish he could have been in the book a little bit longer, especially because of the fact that if you compare that duo to the one that you see in Generations, it's almost completely different. The next arc, Enemy of the State 2, I didn't really enjoy this. Maybe I'm permanently burned out of the, oh, here's the flash forward of what you're going to see at the end of the book, but everything's gone wrong and now you're going to have to read the entire issue to find out what's happened trope that was really overused when I read Kill or Be Killed. But the problem was the scenario that it set up in the opening pages was one that I didn't really care about. I knew there would have been an explanation if Laura had destroyed this little town, as not having one would have been a major setback for her character's development. So there was just a ton of fluff and filler in here that I really could have just done without. He then carried on into Madripoor, and even though it was only for a couple of issues, it just felt like this entire arc was filler that I probably could have done without. Don't get me wrong, it ended stronger than it started, but at the same time I probably could have skipped this and not cared too much. Although it was a bit important for something that happens later on in the book, so I give it a little bit of the benefit of the doubt. And it was good that it tied into those earlier issues, because if it hadn't done that, it would have felt completely disconnected. But the arc after that, for me, was probably the lowest point of this omnibus. The storyline with the virus that was spreading and infecting everyone, you know, kind of like what we've lived through in the last couple of years, and Laura and anybody else with a regeneration factor could absorb it, and then they had to find the source of it, so they went into space, was all just so bland. And these issues did have some big cameos in it, and no, I'm not talking about Ironheart, because she is literally a legacy character that exists only to be a legacy character, and with Laura going into space, this should have been more enjoyable. But at least she got a new costume though, so at least there is a silver, or in this case grey lining. But getting over those two speed bumps brought me to the Orphans of X storyline, which was probably a high point of this omnibus. It went back to being a more personal story that was about Laura and her coming to terms with the past and also who she is. And there was a genuinely shocking moment in this book that I have to give it mad respect for being able to pull off. And it also felt like the story evolving so that Laura could become a bit more mature and wizened in her ways. And weirdly, this arc was longer than the virus one that I just complained about, but it never felt like it. I loved that Dakin was given a bigger role too, and no, I'm still not sure if you pronounce it Dakin, which is something that I haven't learned since I did my video on the Dark Avengers. But that was probably the last time that I saw him feature heavily in something, so it was good to see him appear here, and I do hope that I can see him again in other books. The Orphans of X managed to make themselves a really formidable force for Laura, and she had to adapt to overcome them, and it makes sense that this came as late into the book as it did. Had this been the last story arc, then I think it still would have felt like things had come full circle for Laura, because there was times when she had to think rather than just attack, and she had to show more compassion and empathy. She had to be more rational and understanding, even though, you know, she still does kick ass. And on the topic of kicking though, I do wish she would have used the feet claws more. Now the last story arc I think I'll talk about in a spoiler section in a few minutes, because even just saying the title is kind of ruining it. But one thing that this book did well throughout is the humour. Admittedly, I didn't find Gabby that funny, but again, I hate kids. But the banter between Laura and other characters, whether it be Dakin, Angel, or even Deadpool, was just great, and I think it gave this book a lot of personality. And I'm also glad that I didn't read this book in single issues when it was coming out, because during Marvel Now there was a lot of negativity because it did feel like all of the main characters in the Marvel universe had just been replaced by someone else. And I think because of that, every title that was coming out at the time was tarred with the same brush. And there were some really enjoyable stories that were being released back then, and I do think that All New Wolverine is one of them, and it should be remembered as something more than just a Marvel Now book. Which were rumblings that I kept hearing when this book originally got announced. It's not just something that I'm making up, I don't do that. I definitely have a girlfriend. We're moving into the spoiler section though, so if you don't want anything ruined, I'd recommend skipping to the final verdict timestamp down below. But I loved that this book had an actual ending. It wasn't just left at a certain point so that the next writer could pick it up. Tom Taylor knew that he wanted to complete Laura's story. And even though Old Woman Laura didn't have that emotional punch for me, it still closed out this book well. I felt like I was witnessing an end and this was a conclusion, and that it was going to be definitive. And yeah, sure, it is a bit of a cliche to have your main character dying of a disease just so that you can have that clock that's ticking with every page that goes by. But I didn't mind it too much in this book because of the fact that she had a healing factor to begin with. So, you know, I don't want to sound like a dick, but you already should have died about 100 times before this point. This story arc also made me like Gabby a bit more now that she was older and that she'd matured. And it made me somewhat sentimental for the connection that her and Laura had had throughout this book. As well, just seeing her in some badass futuristic Wolverine suit was just great. It looked heavily Tron inspired, and I was very okay with that. And as well, I just like that if this was the last time that I ever saw these two characters, I'm happy with the conclusion that I got. Laura being so high up and powerful in Madripoor, and also Kamala's development was just great to see. The Doctor Doom inclusion was a nice surprise as well, and there's very rarely a time that I don't enjoy seeing him be the villain, and I think that being the cause that Laura goes up against is a fitting conclusion to this story, and also this character that we've seen her develop into over the course of this omnibus. And what I really liked is that although the jump in time was decades, it never felt like anything was out of place. There wasn't one thing that I thought was a massive leap in logic that wouldn't be possible, so in my head I can have this as a canon ending. This is my final verdict, and I imagine it's difficult to write a legacy character, especially if it's for Wolverine. Logan is such a beloved comic character that's broken out beyond the medium that I find anybody stepping into that role would face a tall order. But All New Logan by Tom Taylor wants to tackle that feat head on. In these 30+ issues, Taylor doesn't try to make Laura fit into the mold that was set before her by Logan, but instead highlight out why she's a fascinating character by herself. I haven't read anything where she's the focus for a number of years, but this was a great reintroduction that I'd recommend to anybody who's looking for a fun and quirky take on a character with an adamantium skeleton. Although not the best Marvel Now title that I've read, it still manages to give a full beginning, middle and end in this one omnibus. And at times, yes, the story could be a bit dull, but only when I compared it to what had come before. And the art never fails to get the job done, even if some artists did leave more of an impression than others. So if you have this on your shelf or in your to read pile, I'd definitely make time so that you could crack it open, and don't hesitate to buy it if it had already caught your eye, because it is a good time even if it never manages to walk through the door of greatness. So with that in mind, I'm going to give it a very respectable score of 70%. Woof woof! So that's my review. If you've checked out this book, let me know what you think about it in the comment section below. But I guess that's the video, and until next time, just make sure that you stay safe and stay mad, all you dogs. Woof woof! See you at the next video.